Buddhism. In today's video we'll learn about Buddhism. Going through the sections. Abstract, Life of the Buddha, Worldview, Paths to Liberation, Common Buddhist Practices, Buddhist Texts, History, Schools and Traditions, Monasteries and Temples, Buddhism in the Modern Era, Cultural Influence, Demographics, Notes, External Links. Abstract. Buddhism is the world's fourth largest religion with over 520 million followers, or over 7% of the global population, known as Buddhists. Buddhism encompasses a variety of traditions, beliefs and spiritual practices largely based on original teachings attributed to the Buddha and resulting interpretive philosophies. It originated in ancient India as a Sramana tradition sometime between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, spreading through much of Asia. Two major extant branches of Buddhism are generally recognized by scholars: Theravada, Pali, the School of the Elders, and Mahayana, Sanskrit, the Great Vehicle. As expressed in the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, the goal of Buddhism is to overcome suffering, dukkha, caused by desire, attachment to a static self, and ignorance of the true nature of reality, avidya. Most Buddhist traditions emphasize transcending the individual self through the attainment of nirvana or by following the path of Buddhahood, ending the cycle of death and rebirth. Buddhist schools vary in their interpretation of the path to liberation, the relative importance and canonicity assigned to the various Buddhist texts, and their specific teachings and practices. Widely observed practices include taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, observance of moral precepts, Buddhist monasticism, Buddhist meditation, and the cultivation of the paramitas, perfections, or virtues. Theravada Buddhism has a widespread following in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia such as Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand. Mahayana, which includes the traditions of Pure Land, Zen, Nichiren Buddhism, Shingon and Tendai, is found throughout East Asia. Vajrayana, a body of teachings attributed to Indian adepts, may be viewed as a separate branch or as an aspect of Mahayana Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism, which preserves the Vajrayana teachings of 8th century India, is practiced in the countries of the Himalayan region, Mongolia, and Kalmykia. This project compresses information gathered from Wikipedia in video format. Why should I watch it? Studies prove that reading while listening improves comprehension, increases speed as well as expands vocabulary and enhances fluency. Provide your feedback on the comments section. Support the channel by subscribing and liking the video. Thanks. Life of the Buddha. Buddhism is an Indian religion founded on the teachings of a mendicant and spiritual teacher called the Buddha. Early texts have the Buddha's family name as Gautama, Pali, Gautama. The details of Buddha's life are mentioned in many early Buddhist texts but are inconsistent, and his social background and life details are difficult to prove. The precise dates are uncertain. The evidence of the early texts suggests that Siddhartha Gautama was born in Lumbini and grew up in Kapilavastu, a town in the Ganges Plain, near the modern Nepal-India border, and that he spent his life in what is now modern Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. Some hagiographic legends state that his father was a king named Suddhodana, his mother was Queen Maya, and he was born in Lumbini. However, scholars such as Richard Gombrich consider this a dubious claim because a combination of evidence suggests he was born in the Shakya community, which was governed by a small oligarchy or republic-like council where there were no ranks but where seniority mattered instead. Some of the stories about Buddha, his life, his teachings, and claims about the society he grew up in may have been invented and interpolated at a later time into the Buddhist texts. According to early texts such as the Pali Aryaparayana Sutta and its Chinese parallel at M204, Gautama was moved by the suffering, dukkha, of life and death, and its endless repetition due to rebirth. He thus set out on a quest to find liberation from suffering, also known as nirvana. Early texts and biographies state that Gautama first studied under two teachers of meditation, namely Alara Kalama, Sanskrit, Ardhakalama, and Uddaka Ramaputta, Sanskrit, Udraka Ramaputra, learning meditation and philosophy, particularly the meditative attainment of the sphere of nothingness from the former, and the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception from the latter. Finding these teachings to be insufficient to attain his goal, he turned to the practice of severe asceticism, which included a strict fasting regime and various forms of breath control. This too fell short of attaining his goal, and then he turned to the meditative practice of dhyana. He famously sat in meditation under a ficus religiosa tree now called the Bodhi tree in the town of Bodh Gaya and attained awakening, Bodhi. According to various early texts like the Māsakkha Sutta and the Samaphala Sutta, on awakening, the Buddha gained insight into the workings of karma and his former lives, as well as achieving the ending of the mental defilements, asavas, the ending of suffering, and the end of rebirth in sattva. This event also brought certainty about the middle way as the right path of spiritual practice to end suffering. As a fully enlightened Buddha, he attracted followers and founded a Sangha, monastic order. He spent the rest of his life teaching the Dharma he had discovered, and then died, achieving final nirvana, at the age of 80 in Kushinagar, India. Buddha's teachings were propagated by his followers, which in the last centuries of the first millennium BCE became various Buddhist schools of thought, each with its own basket of texts containing different interpretations and authentic teachings of the Buddha. These over time evolved into many traditions, of which the more well-known and widespread in the modern era are Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana Buddhism. Worldview. The term Buddhism is an Occidental neologism, commonly, and rather roughly according to Donald S. Lopez Jr., used as a translation for the Dharma of the Buddha, Phyo in Chinese, Bukki in Japanese, Nang Pasang Srigas Pai Chos in Tibetan, Buddha Dharma in Sanskrit, Buddha Shana in Pali. The Four Truths express the basic orientation of Buddhism. We crave and cling to impermanent states and things, which is dukkha, incapable of satisfying and painful. This keeps us caught in samsara, the endless cycle of repeated rebirth, dukkha and dying again. But there is a way to liberation from this endless cycle to the state of nirvana, namely following the Noble Eightfold Path. The truth of dukkha is the basic insight that life in this mundane world, with its clinging and craving to impermanent states and things, is dukkha, and unsatisfactory. Dukkha can be translated as incapable of satisfying, the unsatisfactory nature and the general insecurity of all conditioned phenomena, or painful. Dukkha is most commonly translated as suffering, but this is inaccurate, since it refers not to episodic suffering, but to the intrinsically unsatisfactory nature of temporary states and things, including pleasant but temporary experiences. We expect happiness from states and things which are impermanent, and therefore cannot attain real happiness. In Buddhism, dukkha is one of the three marks of existence, along with impermanence and anat, non-self. Buddhism, like other major Indian religions, asserts that everything is impermanent, anicca, but, unlike them, also asserts that there is no permanent self or soul in living beings, anat. The ignorance or misperception, avijja, that anything is permanent or that there is self in any being is considered a wrong understanding, and the primary source of clinging and dukkha. Dukkha arises when we crave and cling to these changing phenomena. The clinging and craving produces karma, which ties us to samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. Craving includes kama-tanha, craving for sense pleasures, bhava-tanha, craving to continue the cycle of life and death, including rebirth, and vibhava-tanha, craving to not experience the world and painful feelings. Dukkha ceases, or can be confined, when craving and clinging cease or are confined. This also means that no more karma is being produced, and rebirth ends. Cessation is nirvana, blowing out, and peace of mind. By following the Buddhist path to moksha, liberation, one starts to disengage from craving and clinging to impermanent states and things. The term path is usually taken to mean the Noble Eightfold Path, but other versions of the path can also be found in the Nikayas. The Theravada tradition regards insight into the Four Truths as liberating in itself. Sasra means wandering or world, with a connotation of cyclic, circuitous change. It refers to the theory of rebirth and cyclicality of all life, matter, existence, a fundamental assumption of Buddhism, as with all major Indian religions. Samsara in Buddhism is considered to be dukkha, unsatisfactory and painful, perpetuated by desire and avidya, ignorance, and the resulting karma. The theory of rebirths, and realms in which these rebirths can occur, is extensively developed in Buddhism, in particular Tibetan Buddhism with its wheel of existence, Bhavacakra, doctrine. Liberation from this cycle of existence, nirvana, has been the foundation and the most important historical justification of Buddhism. The later Buddhist texts assert that rebirth can occur in 6 realms of existence, namely 3 good realms, heavenly, demigod, human, and 3 evil realms, animal, hungry ghosts, hellish. Samsara ends if a person attains nirvana, the blowing out of the desires and the gaining of true insight into impermanence and non-self reality. Rebirth refers to a process whereby beings go through a succession of lifetimes as one of many possible forms of sentient life, each running from conception to death. In Buddhist thought, this rebirth does not involve any soul, because of its doctrine of anat, Sanskrit, Antman, no self doctrine, which rejects the concepts of a permanent self or an unchanging, eternal soul, as it is called in Hinduism and Christianity. According to Buddhism, there ultimately is no such thing as a self in any being or any essence in anything. The Buddhist traditions have traditionally disagreed on what it is in a person that is reborn, as well as how quickly the rebirth occurs after each death. Some Buddhist traditions assert that no self doctrine means that there is no perjuring self, but there is a vachya, inexpressible, self which migrates from one life to another. The majority of Buddhist traditions, in contrast, assert that vina, a person's consciousness, though evolving, exists as a continuum and is the mechanistic basis of what undergoes rebirth, rebecoming and redeath. The rebirth depends on the merit or demerit gained by one's karma, as well as that accrued on one's behalf by a family member. Each rebirth takes place within one of 5 realms according to Theravadins, or 6 according to other schools: heavenly, demigods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts and hellish. In East Asian and Tibetan Buddhism, rebirth is not instantaneous, and there is an intermediate state, Tibetan Bardo, between one life and the next. The orthodox Theravada position rejects the weight, and asserts that rebirth of a being is immediate. However, there are passages in the Samyutta Nikaya of the Pali Canon that seem to lend support to the idea that the Buddha taught about an intermediate stage between one life and the next. In Buddhism, karma, from Sanskrit, action, work, drives samsara, the endless cycle of suffering and rebirth for each being. Good, skillful deeds, ply, kusala, and bad, unskillful deeds, ply, akusala, produce seeds in the unconscious receptacle, laya, that mature later either in this life or in a subsequent rebirth. The existence of karma is a core belief in Buddhism. As with all major Indian religions, it implies neither fatalism nor that everything that happens to a person is caused by karma. A central aspect of Buddhist theory of karma is that intent, satan, matters and is essential to bring about a consequence or phala fruit or vipkara result. However, good or bad karma accumulates even if there is no physical action, and just having ill or good thoughts creates karmic seeds. Thus, actions of body, speech or mind all lead to karmic seeds. In the Buddhist traditions, life aspects affected by the law of karma in past and current births of a being include the form of rebirth, realm of rebirth, social class, character and major circumstances of a lifetime. It operates like the laws of physics, without external intervention, on every being in all 6 realms of existence including human beings and gods. A notable aspect of the karma theory in Buddhism is merit transfer. A person accumulates merit not only through intentions and ethical living, but also is able to gain merit from others by exchanging goods and services, such as through DNA. Further, a person can transfer one's own good karma to living family members and ancestors. The cessation of the kleshas and the attainment of nirvana, nibbana, with which the cycle of rebirth ends, has been the primary and the soteriological goal of the Buddhist path for monastic life since the time of the Buddha. The term path is usually taken to mean the Noble Eightfold Path, but other versions of the path can also be found in the Nikayas. In some passages in the Pali Canon, a distinction is being made between right knowledge or insight, and right liberation or release, sambhimutti, as the means to attain cessation and liberation. Nirvana literally means blowing out, quenching, becoming extinguished. In early Buddhist texts, it is the state of restraint and self-control that leads to the blowing out and the ending of the cycles of sufferings associated with rebirths and redeaths. Many later Buddhist texts describe nirvana as identical with anatta, with complete emptiness, nothingness. In some texts, the state is described with greater detail, such as passing through the gate of emptiness, sunyata, realizing that there is no soul or self in any living being, then passing through the gate of signlessness, animitta, realizing that nirvana cannot be perceived, and finally passing through the gate of wishlessness, apranihita, realizing that nirvana is the state of not even wishing for nirvana. The nirvana state has been described in Buddhist texts partly in a manner similar to other Indian religions, as the state of complete liberation, enlightenment, highest happiness, bliss, fearlessness, freedom, permanence, non-dependent origination, unfathomable, and indescribable. It has also been described in part differently, as a state of spiritual release marked by emptiness and realization of non-self. While Buddhism considers the liberation from samsara as the ultimate spiritual goal, in traditional practice, the primary focus of a vast majority of lay Buddhists has been to seek and accumulate merit through good deeds, donations to monks and various Buddhist rituals in order to gain better rebirths rather than nirvana. Pratityasamutpada, also called dependent arising, or dependent origination, is the Buddhist theory to explain the nature and relations of being, becoming, existence and ultimate reality. Buddhism asserts that there is nothing independent, except the state of nirvana. All physical and mental states depend on and arise from other pre-existing states, and in turn from them arise other dependent states while they cease. The dependent arisings have a causal conditioning, and thus pratityasamutpada is the Buddhist belief that causality is the basis of ontology, not a creator god nor the ontological Vedic concept called universal self, Brahman, nor any other transcendent creative principle. However, the Buddhist thought does not understand causality in terms of Newtonian mechanics, rather it understands it as conditioned arising. In Buddhism, dependent arising is referring to conditions created by a plurality of causes that necessarily co-originate a phenomenon within and across lifetimes, such as karma in one life creating conditions that lead to rebirth in one of the realms of existence for another lifetime. Buddhism applies the dependent arising theory to explain origination of endless cycles of dukkha and rebirth, through its 12 nidnas or 12 links doctrine. It states that because avadhi, ignorance, exists saskras, karmic formations, exists, because saskras exists therefore vina, consciousness, exists, and in a similar manner it links marpa, sentient body, ayatana, 6 senses, spara, sensory stimulation, vedan, feeling, ta, craving, upna, grasping, bhava, becoming, jti, birth, and jarmara, old age, death, sorrow, pain. By breaking the circuitous links of the 12 nidanas, Buddhism asserts that liberation from these endless cycles of rebirth and dukkha can be attained. A related doctrine in Buddhism is that of Anet, Pali, or Atman, Sanskrit. It is the view that there is no unchanging, permanent self, soul or essence in phenomena. The Buddha and Buddhist philosophers who follow him such as Visabandhu and Buddhaghosa, generally argue for this view by analyzing the person through the schema of the 5 aggregates, and then attempting to show that none of these 5 components of personality can be permanent or absolute. This can be seen in Buddhist discourses such as the Anatalakkhana Sutta. Emptiness or voidness is a related concept with many different interpretations throughout the various Buddhisms. In early Buddhism, it was commonly stated that all 5 aggregates are void, riddhika, hollow, tukaka, coreless, asraka, for example as in the Pheppipama Sutta, SN 2295. Similarly, in Theravada Buddhism, it often simply means that the 5 aggregates are empty of a self. Emptiness is the central concept in Mahayana Buddhism, especially in Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka school, and in the Prajnaparamita Sutras. In Madhyamaka philosophy, emptiness is the view which holds that all phenomena, dharmas, are without any svabhava, literally own nature or self-nature, and are thus without any underlying essence, and so are empty of being independent. This doctrine sought to refute the heterodox theories of svabhava circulating at the time. All forms of Buddhism revere and take spiritual refuge in the 3 jewels, Triratna, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. While all varieties of Buddhism revere Buddha and Buddhahood, they have different views on what these are. Whatever that may be, Buddha is still central to all forms of Buddhism. In Theravada Buddhism, a Buddha is someone who has become awake through their own efforts and insight. They have put an end to their cycle of rebirths and have ended all unwholesome mental states which lead to bad action and thus are morally perfected. While subject to the limitations of the human body in certain ways, for example, in the early texts, the Buddha suffers from backaches. A Buddha is said to be deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom as is the great ocean, and also has immense psychic powers. Theravada generally sees Gautama Buddha, the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, as the only Buddha of the current era. While he is no longer in this world, he has left us the Dharma, teaching, the Vinaya, discipline, and the Sangha, community. There are also said to be 2 types of Buddhas. A Samasambuddha is also said to teach the Dharma to others, while a Pacceka Buddha, solitary Buddha, does not teach. Mahayana Buddhism meanwhile, has a vastly expanded cosmology, with various Buddhas and other holy beings, areas, residing in different realms. Mahayana texts not only revere numerous Buddhas besides Shakyamuni, such as Amitabha and Vairocana, but also see them as transcendental or supermundane, Lokuttara, beings. Mahayana Buddhism holds that these other Buddhas in other realms can be contacted and are able to benefit beings in this world. In Mahayana, a Buddha is a kind of spiritual king, a protector of all creatures with a lifetime that is countless of eons long, rather than just a human teacher who has transcended the world after death. Buddha Shakyamuni's life and death on earth is then usually understood as a mere appearance or a manifestation skillfully projected into earthly life by a long enlightened transcendent being, who is still available to teach the faithful through visionary experiences. Dharma, Pali, Dhamma, in Buddhism refers to the Buddha's teaching, which includes all of the main ideas outlined above. While this teaching reflects the true nature of reality, it is not a belief to be clung to, but a pragmatic teaching to be put into practice. It is likened to a raft which is for crossing over, to nirvana, not for holding on to. It also refers to the universal law and cosmic order which that teaching both reveals and relies upon. It is an everlasting principle which applies to all beings and worlds. In that sense it is also the ultimate truth and reality about the universe, it is thus the way that things really are. The Dharma is the second of the three jewels which all Buddhists take refuge in. All Buddhas in all worlds, in the past, present and in the future, are believed by Buddhists to understand and teach the Dharma. Indeed, it is part of what makes them a Buddha that they do so. The third jewel which Buddhists take refuge in is the Sangha, which refers to the monastic community of monks and nuns who follow Gautama Buddha's monastic discipline, which was designed to shape the Sangha as an ideal community, with the optimum conditions for spiritual growth. The Sangha consists of those who have chosen to follow the Buddha's ideal way of life, which is one of celibate monastic renunciation with minimal material possessions. The Sangha is seen as important because they preserve and pass down Buddha Dharma. As Gethin states, the Sangha lives the teaching, preserves the teaching as scriptures and teaches the wider community. Without the Sangha there is no Buddhism. The Sangha also acts as a field of merit for laypersons, allowing them to make spiritual merit or goodness by donating to the Sangha and supporting them. In return, they keep their duty to preserve and spread the Dharma everywhere for the good of the world. The Sangha is also supposed to follow the Vinaya, monastic rule, of the Buddha, thereby serving as an spiritual example for the world and future generations. The Vinaya rules also force the Sangha to live in dependence on the rest of the lay community and thus draw the Sangha into a relationship with the lay community. There is also a separate definition of Sangha, referring to those who have attained any stage of awakening, whether or not they are monastics. This Sangha is called the Ryasaha Noble Sangha. All forms of Buddhism generally reveres these Ryas, Pali, Arya, noble ones or holy ones, who are spiritually attained beings. Aryas have attained the fruits of the Buddhist path. Becoming an Arya is a goal in most forms of Buddhism. The Ryasaha includes holy beings such as bodhisattvas, arhats and stream enterers. In early Buddhism and in Theravada Buddhism, an arhat, literally meaning worthy, is someone who reached the same awakening, bodhi, of a Buddha by following the teaching of a Buddha. They are seen as having ended rebirth and all the mental defilements. A bodhisattva, a being bound for awakening, meanwhile, is simply a name for someone who is working towards awakening, bodhi, as a Buddha. According to all the early Buddhist schools as well as Theravada, to be considered a bodhisattva one has to have made a vow in front of a living Buddha and also has to have received a confirmation of one's future Buddhahood. In Theravada, the future Buddha is called Maitreya, and he is revered as a bodhisattva currently working for future Buddhahood. Mahayana Buddhism generally sees the attainment of the arhat as an inferior one, since it is seen as being done only for the sake of individual liberation. It thus promotes the bodhisattva path as the highest and most worthwhile. While in Mahayana, anyone who has given rise to bodhicitta is considered a bodhisattva. Some of those holy beings, such as Maitreya and Avalokitesvara, have reached very high levels of spiritual attainment and are seen as being very powerful supramundane beings who provide aid to countless beings through their advanced powers. Mahayana Buddhism also differs from Theravada and the other schools of early Buddhism in promoting several unique doctrines which are contained in Mahayana sutras and philosophical treatises. One of these is the unique interpretation of emptiness and dependent origination found in the Madhyamaka school. Another very influential doctrine for Mahayana is the main philosophical view of the Yogacara school, variously termed Vijaptimtratva, the doctrine that there are only ideas or mental impressions, or Vinavda, the doctrine of consciousness. According to Mark Sideritz, what classical Yogacara thinkers like Vasubandhu had in mind is that we are only ever aware of mental images or impressions, which may appear as external objects, but there is actually no such thing outside the mind. There are several interpretations of this main theory. Many scholars see it as a type of idealism, others as a kind of phenomenology. Another very influential concept unique to Mahayana is that of Buddha nature, Buddhatu, or Tathagata womb, Tathagata. Buddha nature is a concept found in some 1st millennium CE Buddhist texts, such as the Tathagata sutras. According to Paul Williams, these sutras suggest that all sentient beings contain a Tathagata as their essence, core inner nature, self. According to Karl Brunholtzl, the earliest Mahayana sutras that are based on and discuss the notion of Tathagata as the Buddha potential that is innate in all sentient beings began to appear in written form in the late 2nd and early 3rd century. For some, the doctrine seems to conflict with the Buddhist Anatta doctrine, non-self, leading scholars to posit that the Tathagata sutras were written to promote Buddhism to non-Buddhists. This can be seen in texts like the Lakevatra Sutra, which state that Buddha nature is taught to help those who have fear when they listen to the teaching of Anatta. Buddhist texts like the Ratnagotravattaka clarify that the self implied in Tathagata doctrine is actually not self. Various interpretations of the concept have been advanced by Buddhist thinkers throughout the history of Buddhist thought, and most attempt to avoid anything like the Hindu Atman doctrine. These Indian Buddhist ideas, in various synthetic ways, form the basis of subsequent Mahayana philosophy in Tibetan Buddhism and East Asian Buddhism, paths to liberation. While the Noble Eightfold Path is best known in the West, a wide variety of paths and models of progress have been used and described in the different Buddhist traditions. However, they generally share basic practices such as sila, ethics, samadhi, meditation, dhyana, and praja, wisdom, which are known as the 3 trainings. An important additional practice is a kind and compassionate attitude toward every living being in the world. Devotion is also important in some Buddhist traditions, and in the Tibetan traditions visualizations of deities and mandalas are important. The value of textual study is regarded differently in the various Buddhist traditions. It is central to Theravada and highly important to Tibetan Buddhism, while the Zen tradition takes an ambiguous stance. An important guiding principle of Buddhist practice is the middle way, Madhyama Pratipad. It was a part of Buddha's first sermon, where he presented the Noble Eightfold Path that was a middle way between the extremes of asceticism and hedonistic sense pleasures. In Buddhism, states Harvey, the doctrine of dependent arising, conditioned arising, pratyasamutpta, to explain rebirth is viewed as the middle way between the doctrines that a being has a permanent soul involved in rebirth, eternalism, and death is final and there is no rebirth, annihilationism. A common presentation style of the path, Mrga, to liberation in the early Buddhist texts is the graduated talk, in which the Buddha lays out a step-by-step training. In the early texts, numerous different sequences of the gradual path can be found. One of the most important and widely used presentations among the various Buddhist schools is the Noble Eightfold Path, or Eightfold Path of the Noble Ones. This can be found in various discourses, most famously in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Other suttas such as the Tivijaya Sutta, and the Kulahathipatopama Sutta give a different outline of the path, though with many similar elements such as ethics and meditation. According to Rupert Gethin, the path to awakening is also frequently summarized by a short formula: abandoning the hindrances, practice of the 4 establishings of mindfulness, and development of the awakening factors. The Eightfold Path consists of a set of 8 interconnected factors or conditions, that when developed together, lead to the cessation of dukkha. These 8 factors are: right view, or right understanding, right intention, or right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This Eightfold Path is the 4th of the 4 Noble Truths, and asserts the path to the cessation of dukkha, suffering, pain, unsatisfactoriness. The path teaches that the way of the enlightened ones stopped their craving, clinging and karmic accumulations, and thus ended their endless cycles of rebirth and suffering. The Noble Eightfold Path is grouped into 3 basic divisio ns, as follows. Theravada Buddhism is a diverse tradition and thus includes different explanations of the path to awakening. However, the teachings of the Buddha are often encapsulated by Theravadins in the basic framework of the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Some Theravada Buddhists also follow the presentation of the path laid out in Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga. This presentation is known as the 7 Purifications, Sata Visuddhi. This schema and its accompanying outline of insight knowledges is used by modern influential Theravada scholars, such Mahasi Sayadaw, in his The Progress of Insight, and Jnanati Lokottara, in the Buddha's path to deliverance. Mahayana Buddhism is based principally upon the path of a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva refers to one who is on the path to Buddhahood. The term Mahayana was originally a synonym for bodhisattva or bodhisattva vehicle. In the earliest texts of Mahayana Buddhism, the path of a bodhisattva was to awaken the bodhicitta. Between the 1st and 3rd century CE, this tradition introduced the 10 bhumi doctrine, which means 10 levels or stages of awakening. This development was followed by the acceptance that it is impossible to achieve Buddhahood in one current lifetime, and the best goal is not nirvana for oneself, but Buddhahood after climbing through the 10 levels during multiple rebirths. Mahayana scholars then outlined an elaborate path for monks and laypeople, and the path includes the vow to help teach Buddhist knowledge to other beings, so as to help them cross samsara and liberate themselves, once one reaches the Buddhahood in a future rebirth. One part of this path are the pramit, perfections, to cross over, derived from the Jatakas tales of Buddha's numerous rebirths. The doctrine of the Bodhisattvamas was also eventually merged with the Sarvastivadvaika schema of the 5 paths by the Yogacara school. This Mahayana 5 paths presentation can be seen in Asanga's Mahayanasagraya. The Mahayana texts are inconsistent in their discussion of the pramits, and some texts include lists of 2, others 4, 6, 10 and 52. The 6 paramitas have been most studied, and these are: in Mahayana sutras that include 10 pramit, the additional 4 perfections are skillful means, vow, power and knowledge. The most discussed pramit and the highest rated perfection in Mahayana texts is the prajnaparamita, or the perfection of insight. This insight in the Mahayana tradition, states Sheiichi Mora, has been the insight of non-duality or the absence of reality in all things. East Asian Buddhism and influenced by both the classic Indian Buddhist presentations of the path such as the Eightfold Path as well as classic Indian Mahayana presentations such as that found in the Divijalan. There are many different presentations of soteriology, including numerous paths and vehicles, yanas, in the different traditions of East Asian Buddhism. There is no single dominant presentation. In Zen Buddhism, for example, one can find outlines of the path such as the 2 entrances and 4 practices, the 5 ranks, the 10 ox-herding pictures and the 3 mysterious gates of Linji. In Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, the path to liberation is outlined in the genre known as Lamrim, stages of the path. All the various Tibetan schools have their own Lamrim presentations. This genre can be traced to Adiya's 11th century A Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, Bodhipatha Pridpa. Common Buddhist practices. In various suttas which present the graduated path taught by the Buddha, such as the Samephala Sutta and the Kulahathipadopama Sutta, the first step on the path is hearing the Buddha teach the Dharma. This then said to lead to the acquiring of confidence or faith in the Buddha's teachings. Mahayana Buddhist teachers such as Yin Shun also state that hearing the Dharma and study of the Buddhist discourses is necessary if one wants to learn and practice the Buddha Dharma. Likewise, in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, the stages of the path, Lamrim, texts generally place the activity of listening to the Buddhist teachings as an important early practice. Traditionally, the first step in most Buddhist schools requires taking of the 3 refuges, also called the 3 jewels, Sanskrit, Triratna, Pali, Tirtana, as the foundation of one's religious practice. This practice may have been influenced by the Brahmanical motif of the triple refuge, found in the Rigveda 9.97.47, Rigveda 6.46.9 and Chandogya Upanishad February 22, 1934. Tibetan Buddhism sometimes adds a 4th refuge, in the Lama. The 3 refuges are believed by Buddhists to be protective and a form of reverence. The ancient formula which is repeated for taking refuge affirms that I go to the Buddha as refuge, I go to the Dhamma as refuge, I go to the Sangha as refuge. Reciting the 3 refuges, according to Harvey, is considered not as a place to hide, rather a thought that purifies, uplifts and strengthens the heart. La, Sanskrit, or sla is the concept of moral virtues, that is the second group and an integral part of the Noble Eightfold Path. It generally consists of right speech, right action and right livelihood. One of the most basic forms of ethics in Buddhism is the taking of precepts. This includes the 5 precepts for lay people, 8 or 10 precepts for monastic life, as well as rules of Dhamma, Vinaya or Patimokkha, adopted by a monastery. Other important elements of Buddhist ethics include giving or charity, met, goodwill, heedfulness, appamada, self-respect, and regard for consequences, appatrapya. Buddhist scriptures explain the 5 precepts as the minimal standard of Buddhist morality. It is the most important system of morality in Buddhism, together with the monastic rules. The 5 precepts are seen as a basic training applicable to all Buddhists. They are: undertaking and upholding the 5 precepts is based on the principle of non-harming. The Pali Canon recommends one to compare oneself with others, and on the basis of that, not to hurt others. Compassion and a belief in karmic retribution form the foundation of the precepts. Undertaking the 5 precepts is part of regular lay devotional practice, both at home and at the local temple. However, the extent to which people keep them differs per region and time. They are sometimes referred to as the Ravakina precepts in the Mahayana tradition, contrasting them with the Bodhisattva precepts. The 5 precepts are not commandments, and transgressions do not invite religious sanctions, but their power has been based on the Buddhist belief in karmic consequences and their impact in the afterlife. Killing in Buddhist belief leads to rebirth in the hell realms, and for a longer time in more severe conditions if the murder victim was a monk. Adultery, similarly, invites a rebirth as prostitute or in hell, depending on whether the partner was unmarried or married. These moral precepts have been voluntarily self-enforced in lay Buddhist culture through the associated belief in karma and rebirth. Within the Buddhist doctrine, the precepts are meant to develop mind and character to make progress on the path to enlightenment. The monastic life in Buddhism has additional precepts as part of Patimokkha, and unlike lay people, transgressions by monks do invite sanctions. Full expulsion from Sangha follows any instance of killing, engaging in sexual intercourse, theft or false claims about one's knowledge. Temporary expulsion follows a lesser offense. The sanctions vary per monastic fraternity, Nikaya. Laypeople and novices in many Buddhist fraternities also uphold 8, Astashila, or 10, Dashila, from time to time. 4 of these are same as for the lay devotee: no killing, no stealing, no lying, and no intoxicants. The other 4 precepts are: all 8 precepts are sometimes observed by lay people on Uposatha days, full moon, new moon, the first and last quarter following the lunar calendar. The 10 precepts also include to abstain from accepting money. In addition to these precepts, Buddhist monasteries have hundreds of rules of conduct, which are a part of its Patimokkha. Vinaya is the specific code of conduct for a sangha of monks or nuns. It includes the Patimokkha, a set of 227 offenses including 75 rules of decorum for monks, along with penalties for transgression, in the Theravadan tradition. The precise content of the Vinaya Pitaka, scriptures on the Vinaya, differs in different schools and tradition, and different monasteries set their own standards on its implementation. The list of Patimokkha is recited every fortnight in a ritual gathering of all monks. Buddhist texts with Vinaya rules for monasteries have been traced in all Buddhist traditions, with the oldest surviving being the ancient Chinese translations. Monastic communities in the Buddhist tradition cut normal social ties to family and community, and live as islands unto themselves. Within a monastic fraternity, a sangha has its own rules. A monk abides by these institutionalized rules, and living life as the Vinaya prescribes it is not merely a means, but very nearly the end in itself. Transgressions by a monk on Sangha Vinaya rules invites enforcement, which can include temporary or permanent expulsion. Another important practice taught by the Buddha is the restraint of the senses, Indriyasamvara. In the various graduated paths, this is usually presented as a practice which is taught pre or to formal sitting meditation, and which supports meditation by weakening sense desires that are a hindrance to meditation. According to Anne Lao, sense restraint is when one guards the sense doors in order to prevent sense impressions from leading to desires and discontent. This is not an avoidance of sense impression, but a kind of mindful attention towards the sense impressions which does not dwell on their main features or signs, nimitta. This is said to prevent harmful influences from entering the mind. This practice is said to give rise to an inner peace and happiness which forms a basis for concentration and insight. A related Buddhist virtue and practice is renunciation, or the intent for desirelessness, nekkhamma. Generally, renunciation is the giving up of actions and desires that are seen as unwholesome on the path, such as lust for sensuality and worldly things. Renunciation can be cultivated in different ways. The practice of giving, for example, is one form of cultivating renunciation. Another one is the giving up of lay life and becoming a monastic, bhikshu o bhikkhuni. Practicing celibacy is also a form of renunciation. Ref many Jataka stories such as the focus on how the Buddha practiced renunciation in past lives. One way of cultivating renunciation taught by the Buddha is the contemplation, anupassana, of the dangers, or negative consequences, of sensual pleasure. As part of the graduated discourse, this contemplation is taught after the practice of giving in morality. Another related practice to renunciation and sense restraint taught by the Buddha is restraint in eating or moderation with food, which for monks generally means not eating after noon. Devout laypersons also follow this rule during special days of religious observance, apposatha. Observing the apposatha also includes other practices dealing with renunciation, mainly the 8 precepts. For Buddhist monastics, renunciation can also be trained through several optional ascetic practices called dhutaga. In different Buddhist traditions, other related practices which focus on fasting are followed. The training of the faculty called mindfulness, Pali, sati, Sanskrit, smriti, literally meaning recollection, remembering, is central in Buddhism. According to Analayo, mindfulness is a full awareness of the present moment which enhances and strengthens memory. The Indian Buddhist philosopher Asanga defined mindfulness thus: it is non-forgetting by the mind with regard to the object experienced. Its function is non-distraction. According to Rupert Gethin, sati is also an awareness of things in relation to things, and hence an awareness of their relative value. There are different practices and exercises for training mindfulness in the early discourses, such as the 4 satipatthananas, Sanskrit, smrti-upasana, establishments of mindfulness, and gnasati. A closely related mental faculty, which is often mentioned side by side with mindfulness, is sampajañña, or comprehension. This faculty is the ability to comprehend what one is doing and is happening in the mind, and whether it is being influenced by unwholesome states or wholesome ones. A wide range of meditation practices has developed in the Buddhist traditions, but meditation primarily refers to the attainment of samadhi and the practice of dhyana. Samadhi is a calm, undistracted, unified and concentrated state of consciousness. It is defined by Asanga as one-pointedness of mind on the object to be investigated. Its function consists of giving a basis to knowledge. Dhyana is state of perfect equanimity and awareness, upeksati parisuddhi, reached through focused mental training. The practice of dhyana aids in maintaining a calm mind, and avoiding disturbance of this calm mind by mindfulness of disturbing thoughts and feelings. The earliest evidence of yogis and their meditative tradition, states Karl Werner, is found in the Kind hymn 10.136 of the Rigveda. While evidence suggests meditation was practiced in the centuries preceding the Buddha, the meditative methodologies described in the Buddhist texts are some of the earliest among texts that have survived into the modern era. These methodologies likely incorporate what existed before the Buddha as well as those first developed within Buddhism. There is no scholarly agreement on the origin and source of the practice of dhyana. Some scholars, like Bronkhorst, see the 4 dhyanas as a Buddhist invention. Alexander Wynne argues that the Buddha learned dhyana from Brahmanical teachers. Whatever the case, the Buddha taught meditation with a new focus and interpretation, particularly through the 4 dhyanas methodology, in which mindfulness is maintained. Further, the focus of meditation and the underlying theory of liberation guiding the meditation has been different in Buddhism. For example, states Bronkhorst, the verse April 4, 2023 of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad with its become calm, subdued, quiet, patiently enduring, concentrated, one sees soul in oneself is most probably a meditative state. The Buddhist discussion of meditation is without the concept of soul, and the discussion criticizes both the ascetic meditation of Jainism and the real self, soul meditation of Hinduism. Buddhist texts teach various meditation schemas. One of the most prominent is that of the 4 upajjhanas, which are stages of progressively deepening concentration. According to Gethin, they are states of perfect mindfulness, stillness and lucidity. They are described in the Pali Canon as trance-like states without desire. In the early texts, the Buddha is depicted as entering jhana both before his awakening under the Bodhi tree and also before his final nirvana. The 4 upajjhanas are. There is a wide variety of scholarly opinions, both from modern scholars and from traditional Buddhists, on the interpretation of these meditative states as well as varying opinions on how to practice them. Often grouped into the jhana scheme are 4 other meditative states, referred to in the early texts as arupa sampattis, formless attainments. These are also referred to in commentarial literature as immaterial/formless jhanas. The first formless attainment is a place or realm of infinite space without form or color or shape. The second is termed the realm of infinite consciousness. the third is the realm of nothingness, while the fourth is the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. The four rupajnas in Buddhist practice lead to rebirth in successfully better Rupa Brahma heavenly realms, while arupajnas lead into arupa heavens. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha outlines two meditative qualities which are mutually supportive, samadhi and vipassana, Sanskrit, vipayan, insight. The Buddha compares these mental qualities to a swift pair of messengers who together help deliver the message of Nibbana, SN 35.245. The various Buddhist traditions generally see Buddhist meditation as being divided into those two main types. Samatha is also called calming meditation, and focuses on stilling and concentrating the mind, i.e. developing samadhi and the four dhyanas. According to Damien Keown, vipassana meanwhile, focuses on the generation of penetrating and critical insight. There are numerous doctrinal positions and disagreements within the different Buddhist traditions regarding these qualities or forms of meditation. For example, in the Pali Four Ways to Arahantship Sutta, on 4.170, it is said that one can develop calm and then insight, or insight and then calm, or both at the same time. Meanwhile, in Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakawakarak, vipayan is said to be practiced once one has reached samadhi by cultivating the four foundations of mindfulness, smrti-upasanas. Beginning with comments by Lavalate Busan, a series of scholars have argued that these two meditation types reflect a tension between two different ancient Buddhist traditions regarding the use of dhyana, one which focused on insight-based practice and the other which focused purely on dhyana. However, other scholars such as Analayo and Rupert Gethin have disagreed with this two-paths thesis, instead seeing both of these practices as complementary. The four immeasurables or four abodes, also called Brahma-viharas, are virtues or directions for meditation in Buddhist traditions, which helps a person be reborn in the heavenly, Brahma, realm. These are traditionally believed to be a characteristic of the deity Brahma and the heavenly abode he resides in. The four Brahma-vihara are. According to Peter Harvey, the Buddhist scriptures acknowledge that the four Brahma-vihara meditation practices did not originate within the Buddhist tradition. The Brahma-vihara, sometimes as Brahmaloka, along with the tradition of meditation and the above four immeasurables are found in pre-Buddha and post-Buddha Vedic and Sramanic literature. Aspects of the Brahma-vihara practice for rebirths into the heavenly realm have been an important part of Buddhist meditation tradition. According to Gombrich, the Buddhist usage of the Brahma-vihara originally referred to an awakened state of mind, and a concrete attitude toward other beings which was equal to living with Brahman here and now. The later tradition took those descriptions too literally, linking them to cosmology and understanding them as living with Brahman by rebirth in the Brahma world. According to Gombrich, the Buddha taught that kindness, what Christians tend to call love, was a way to salvation. Some Buddhist traditions, especially those associated with Tantric Buddhism, also known as Vajrayana and secret mantra, use images and symbols of deities and Buddhas in meditation. This is generally done by mentally visualizing a Buddha image, and using that image to cultivate calm and insight. One may also visualize and identify oneself with the imagined deity. While visualization practices have been particularly popular in Vajrayana, they may also be found in Mahayana and Theravada traditions. In Tibetan Buddhism, unique tantric techniques which include visualization, but also mantra recitation, mandalas, and other elements, are considered to be much more effective than non-tantric meditations, and they are one of the most popular meditation methods. The methods of unsurpassable Yoga Tantra, Anuttara Yoga Tantra, are in turn seen as the highest and most advanced. Anuttara Yoga practice is divided into two stages, the generation stage and the completion stage. In the generation stage, one meditates on emptiness and visualizes oneself as a deity as well as visualizing its mandala. The focus is on developing clear appearance and divine pride, the understanding that oneself and the deity are one. This method is also known as deity yoga, Devata yoga. There are numerous meditation deities, yidam, used, each with a mandala, a circular symbolic map used in meditation. In the completion stage, one meditates on ultimate reality based on the image that has been generated. Completion stage practices also include techniques such as tummo and powa. These are said to work with subtle body elements, like the energy channels, nadi, vital essences, bindu, vital winds, vayu, and chakras. The subtle body energies are seen as influencing consciousness in powerful ways, and are thus used in order to generate the great bliss, mahasukha, which is used to attain the luminous nature of the mind and realization of the empty and illusory nature of all phenomena, the illusory body, which leads to enlightenment. Completion practices are often grouped into different systems, such as the 6 dharmas of Naropa, and the 6 yogas of Kalachakra. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are also practices and methods which are sometimes seen as being outside of the 2 tantric stages, mainly Mahamudra and Dzogchen, Adiyoga. According to Peter Harvey, whenever Buddhism has been healthy, not only ordained but also more committed lay people have practiced formal meditation. Loud devotional chanting, however, as Harvey, has been the most prevalent Buddhist practice and considered a form of meditation that produces energy, joy, loving-kindness and calm, purifies mind and benefits the chanter. Throughout most of Buddhist history, meditation has been primarily practiced in Buddhist monastic tradition, and historical evidence suggests that serious meditation by lay people has been an exception. In recent history, sustained meditation has been pursued by a minority of monks in Buddhist monasteries. Western interest in meditation has led to a revival where ancient Buddhist ideas and precepts are adapted to Western mores and interpreted liberally, presenting Buddhism as a meditation-based form of spirituality. Praj, Sanskrit, or pa is wisdom, or knowledge of the true nature of existence. Another term which is associated with praj and sometimes is equivalent to it is vipassana or vipayan, Sanskrit, which is often translated as insight. In Buddhist texts, the faculty of insight is often said to be cultivated through the 4 establishments of mindfulness. In the early texts, pa is included as one of the 5 faculties, indriya, which are commonly listed as important spiritual elements to be cultivated. Pa, along with samadhi, is also listed as one of the trainings in the higher states of mind, adhishtasika. The Buddhist tradition regards ignorance, avadi, a fundamental ignorance, misunderstanding or misperception of the nature of reality, as one of the basic causes of dukkha and samsara. Overcoming this ignorance is part of the path to awakening. This overcoming includes the contemplation of impermanence and the non-self nature of reality, and this develops dispassion for the objects of clinging, and liberates a being from dukkha and samsara. Ref. Praj is important in all Buddhist traditions. It is variously described as wisdom regarding the impermanent and not-self nature of dharmas, phenomena, the functioning of karma and rebirth, and knowledge of dependent origination. Likewise, vipayan is described in a similar way, such as in the Pasamhidmagga, where it is said to be the contemplation of things as impermanent, unsatisfactory and not self. Some scholars such as Bronkhorst and Vetter have argued that the idea that insight leads to liberation was a later development in Buddhism and that there are inconsistencies with the early Buddhist presentation of samadhi and insight. However, others such as Khaled Cox and Damien Keown have argued that insight is a key aspect of the early Buddhist process of liberation, which cooperates with samadhi to remove the obstacles to enlightenment. In Theravada Buddhism, the focus of vipassana meditation is to continuously and thoroughly know how phenomena, dhammas, are impermanent, anicca, not self, anatta, and dukkha. The most widely used method in modern Theravada for the practice of vipassana is that found in the Satipatthana Sutta. There is some disagreement in contemporary Theravada regarding samatha and vipassana. Some in the Vipassana movement strongly emphasize the practice of insight over samatha, and other Theravadins disagree with this. In Mahayana Buddhism, the development of insight and tranquility, amitha, are also taught and practiced. The many different schools of Mahayana Buddhism have a large repertoire of meditation techniques to cultivate these qualities. These include visualization of various Buddhas, recitation of a Buddha's name, the use of tantric Buddhist mantras and Taranis. Insight in Mahayana Buddhism also includes gaining a direct understanding of certain Mahayana philosophical views, such as the emptiness view and the consciousness-only view. This can be seen in meditation texts such as Kamalala's Vankrama, Stages of Meditation, 9th century, which teaches insight from the Yoga Madhyamaka perspective. According to Harvey, most forms of Buddhism consider sad, trustful confidence or faith, as a quality which must be balanced by wisdom, and as a preparation for, or accompaniment of, meditation. Because of this devotion, SKT, Bhakti, Pali, Bhakti, is an important part of the practice of most Buddhists. Devotional practices include ritual prayer, prostration, offerings, pilgrimage, and chanting. Buddhist devotion is usually focused on some object, image or location that is seen as holy or spiritually influential. Examples of objects of devotion include paintings or statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, stupas, and Bodhi trees. Public group chanting for devotional and ceremonial is common to all Buddhist traditions and goes back to ancient India, where chanting aided in the memorization of the orally transmitted teachings. Rosaries called malas are used in all Buddhist traditions to count repeated chanting of common formulas or mantras. Chanting is thus a type of devotional group meditation which leads to tranquility and communicates the Buddhist teachings. In East Asian Pure Land Buddhism, devotion to the Buddha Namattapa is the main practice. In Nichiren Buddhism, devotion to the Lotus Sutra is the main practice. Devotional practices such as pujas have been a common practice in Theravada Buddhism, where offerings and group prayers are made to deities and particularly images of Buddha. According to Karl Werner and other scholars, devotional worship has been a significant practice in Theravada Buddhism, and deep devotion is part of Buddhist traditions starting from the earliest days. Guru devotion is a central practice of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. The guru is considered essential into the Buddhist devotee. The guru is the enlightened teacher and ritual master in Vajrayana spiritual pursuits. For someone seeking Buddhahood, the guru is the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, wrote the 12th century Buddhist scholar Sadhanamala. The veneration of and obedience to teachers is also important in Theravada and Zen Buddhism. Based on the Indian principle of ahimsa, non-harming, the Buddha's ethics strongly condemn the harming of all sentient beings, including all animals. He thus condemned the animal sacrifice of the Brahmins as well, hunting and killing animals for food. This led to various policies by Buddhist kings such as Asoka meant to protect animals, such as the establishing of no slaughter days and the banning of hunting on certain circumstances. However, early Buddhist texts depict the Buddha as allowing monastics to eat meat. This seems to be because monastics begged for their food and thus were supposed to accept whatever food was offered to them. This was tempered by the rule that meat had to be 3 times clean, which meant that they had not seen, had not heard, and had no reason to suspect that the animal had been killed so that the meat could be given to them. Also, while the Buddha did not explicitly promote vegetarianism in his discourses, he did state that gaining one's livelihood from the meat trade was unethical. However, this rule was not a promotion of a specific diet, but a rule against the actual killing of animals for food. There was also a famed schism which occurred in the Buddhist community when Devdutta attempted to make vegetarianism compulsory and the Buddha disagreed. In contrast to this, various Mahayana sutras and texts like the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, Shurangama Sutra and the Lankavatara Sutra state that the Buddha promoted vegetarianism out of compassion. Indian Mahayana thinkers like Shantideva promoted the avoidance of meat. Throughout history, the issue of whether Buddhists should be vegetarian has remained a much debated topic, and there is a variety of opinions on this issue among modern Buddhists. In the East Asian Buddhism, most monastics are expected to be vegetarian, and the practice is seen as very virtuous and it is taken up by some devout laypersons. Most Theravadins in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia do not practice vegetarianism and eat whatever is offered by the lay community, who are mostly also not vegetarians. But there are exceptions. Some monks choose to be vegetarian and some abbots like Ajahn Sumedho have encouraged the lay community to donate vegetarian food to the monks. Mahasi Sayadaw, meanwhile, has recommended vegetarianism as the best way to make sure one's meal is pure in 3 ways. Also, the new religious movement Santi Asok promotes vegetarianism. According to Peter Harvey, in the Theravada world, vegetarianism is universally admired, but little practiced. Because of the rule against killing, in many Buddhist countries, most butchers and others who work in the meat trade are non-Buddhists. Likewise, most Tibetan Buddhists have historically tended not to be vegetarian. However, there have been some strong debates and pro-vegetarian arguments by some pro-vegetarian Tibetans. Some influential figures have spoken and written in favor of vegetarianism throughout history, including well-known figures like Shabkar and the 17th Karmapa Ogyen Trinley Dorje, who has mandated vegetarianism in all his monasteries. Buddhist texts. Buddhism, like all Indian religions, was initially an oral tradition in ancient times. The Buddha's words, the early doctrines, concepts, and their traditional interpretations were orally transmitted from one generation to the next. The earliest oral texts were transmitted in Middle Indo-Aryan languages called Prakrits, such as Pali, through the use of communal recitation and other mnemonic techniques. The first Buddhist canonical texts were likely written down in Sri Lanka, about 400 years after the Buddha died. The texts were part of the Tripitakas, and many versions appeared thereafter claiming to be the words of the Buddha. Scholarly Buddhist commentary texts, with named authors, appeared in India, around the 2nd century CE. These texts were written in Pali or Sanskrit, sometimes regional languages, as palm leaf manuscripts, birch bark, painted scrolls, carved into temple walls, and later on paper. Unlike what the Bible is to Christianity and the Quran is to Islam, but like all major ancient Indian religions, there is no consensus among the different Buddhist traditions as to what constitutes the scriptures or a common canon in Buddhism. The general belief among Buddhists is that the canonical corpus is vast. This corpus includes the ancient sutras organized into nikayas or agamas, itself the part of three basket of texts called the Tripitakas. Each Buddhist tradition has its own collection of texts, much of which is translation of ancient Pali and Sanskrit Buddhist texts of India. The Chinese Buddhist canon, for example, includes 2,184 texts in 55 volumes, while the Tibetan canon comprises 1,108 texts all claimed to have been spoken by the Buddha and another 3,461 texts composed by Indian scholars revered in the Tibetan tradition. The Buddhist textual history is vast. Over 40,000 manuscripts, mostly Buddhist, some non-Buddhist, were discovered in 1900 in the Dunhuang Chinese cave alone. The early Buddhist texts refers to the literature which is considered by modern scholars to be the earliest Buddhist material. The first four Pali Nikayas, and the corresponding Chinese Gamas are generally considered to be among the earliest material. Apart from these, there are also fragmentary collections of EBT materials in other languages such as Sanskrit, Khotanese, Tibetan, and Gndhr. The modern study of early Buddhism often relies on comparative scholarship using these various early Buddhist sources to identify parallel texts and common doctrinal content. One feature of these early texts are literary structures which reflect oral transmission, such as widespread repetition. After the development of the different early Buddhist schools, these schools began to develop their own textual collections, which were termed Tripitakas, triple baskets. Many early Tripitakas, like the Pali Tipitaka, were divided into three sections. Vinaya Pitaka focuses on monastic rule, Sutta Pitaka, Buddhist discourses, and Abhidhamma Pitaka, which contain expositions and commentaries on the doctrine. The Pali Tipitaka of the Theravada school constitutes the only complete collection of Buddhist texts in an Indic language which has survived until today. However, many sutras, Vinayas and Abhidharma works from other schools survive in Chinese translation, as part of the Chinese Buddhist canon. According to some sources, some early schools of Buddhism had 5 or 7 Pitakas. Much of the material in the Pali canon is not specifically Theravadan, but is instead the collection of teachings that this school preserved from the early, non-sectarian body of teachings. According to Peter Harvey, it contains material at odds with later Theravadan orthodoxy. He states, the Theravadins, then, may have added texts to the canon for some time, but they do not appear to have tampered with what they already had from an earlier period. A distinctive feature of many Tripitaka collections is the inclusion of a genre called Abhidharma, which dates from the 3rd century BCE and later. According to Khalid Cox, the genre began as explanations and elaborations of the teachings in the suttas but over time evolved into an independent system of doctrinal exposition. Over time, the various Abhidharma traditions developed various disagreements with each other on points of doctrine, which were discussed in the different Abhidharma texts of these schools. The major Abhidharma collections which modern scholars have the most information about are those of the Theravada and Sarvastivada schools. In Sri Lanka and South India, the Theravada Abhidhamma system was the most influential. In addition to the Abhidharma project, some of the schools also began accumulating a literary tradition of scriptural commentary on their respective Tripitakas. These commentaries were particularly important in the Theravada school, and the Pali commentaries remain influential today. Both the Abhidhamma and the Pali commentaries influenced the Visuddhimagga, an important 5th century text by the Theravada scholar Buddhaghosa, who also translated and compiled many of the Ihakoths from older Sinhalese sources. The Sarvastivada school was one of the most influential Abhidharma traditions in North India. The magnum opus of this tradition was the massive Abhidharma commentary called the Madhava, Great Commentary, compiled at a great synod in Kashmir during the reign of Kanishka II. The Abhidharmakasha of Vasubandhu is another very influential Abhidharma work from the northern tradition, which continues to be studied in East Asian Buddhism and in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. The Mahāyanastras are a very broad genre of Buddhist scriptures that the Mahayana Buddhist tradition holds are original teachings of the Buddha. Modern historians generally hold that the first of these texts were composed probably around the 1st century BCE or 1st century CE. In Mahayana, These texts are generally given greater authority than the early Gamas and Abhidharma literature, which are called Nirvikalpa or Hinayana to distinguish them from Mahānastras. Mahāna traditions mainly see these different classes of texts as being designed for different types of persons, with different levels of spiritual understanding. The Mahānastras are mainly seen as being for those of greater capacity. The Mahānastras often claim to articulate the Buddha's deeper, more advanced doctrines, reserved for those who follow the Bodhisattva path. That path is explained as being built upon the motivation to liberate all living beings from unhappiness. Hence the name Mahāna, lit, the great vehicle. Besides the teaching of the Bodhisattva, Mahāna texts also contain expanded cosmologies and mythologies, with many more Buddhas and powerful bodhisattvas, as well as new spiritual practices and ideas. The modern Theravada school does not treat the Mahānastras as authoritative or authentic teachings of the Buddha. Likewise, these texts were not recognized as authoritative by many early Buddhist schools, and in some cases, communities such as the Msika school split up due to this disagreement. Recent scholarship has discovered many early Mahāna texts which shed light into the development of Mahāna. Among these is the Listamba Sutra, which survives in Tibetan and Chinese translation. This text contains numerous sections which are remarkably similar to Pali Suttas. The Listamba Sutra was cited by Mahāna scholars such as the 8th century Yasomitra to be authoritative. This suggests that Buddhist literature of different traditions shared a common core of Buddhist texts in the early centuries of its history, until Mahāna literature diverged about and after the 1st century CE. Mahāna also has a very large literature of philosophical and exegetical texts. These are often called stra, treatises, or virtus, commentaries. Some of this literature was also written in verse form, cariks, the most famous of which is the Madhyamika Carik by Nagarjuna, the foundational text of the Madhyamika school. During the Gupta Empire, a new class of Buddhist sacred literature began to develop, which are called the Tantras. By the 8th century, the Tantric tradition was very influential in India and beyond. Besides drawing on a Mahāna Buddhist framework, these texts also borrowed deities and material from other Indian religious traditions, such as the Iva and Pancaratra traditions, local god/goddess cults, and local spirit worship. Some features of these texts include the widespread use of mantras, meditation on the subtle body, worship of fierce deities, and antinomian and transgressive practices such as ingesting alcohol and performing sexual rituals. History. Historically, the roots of Buddhism lie in the religious thought of Iron Age India around the middle of the 1st millennium BCE. This was a period of great intellectual ferment and socio-cultural change known as the Second Urbanization, marked by the growth of towns and trade, the composition of the Upanishads and the historical emergence of the Rama traditions. New ideas developed both in the Vedic tradition in the form of the Upanishads, and outside of the Vedic tradition through the Rama movements. The term Rama refers to several Indian religious movements parallel to but separate from the historical Vedic religion, including Buddhism, Jainism and others such as Jaivika. Several Rama movements are known to have existed in India before the 6th century BCE, pre-Buddha, pre-Mahavira, and these influenced both the Stika and Stika traditions of Indian philosophy. According to Martin Wilshire, the Rama tradition evolved in India over two phases, namely Pakseka Buddha and Savaka phases, the former being the tradition of individual ascetic and the latter of disciples, and that Buddhism and Jainism ultimately emerged from these. Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical ascetic groups shared and used several similar ideas, but the Rama traditions also drew upon already established Brahmanical concepts and philosophical roots, states Wiltshire, to formulate their own doctrines. Brahmanical motifs can be found in the oldest Buddhist texts, using them to introduce and explain Buddhist ideas. For example, prior to Buddhist developments, the Brahmanical tradition internalized and variously reinterpreted the three Vedic sacrificial fires as concepts such as truth, right, tranquility or restraint. Buddhist texts also refer to the three Vedic sacrificial fires, reinterpreting and explaining them as ethical conduct. The Rama religions challenged and broke with the Brahmanic tradition on core assumptions such as Atman, soul, self, Brahman, the nature of afterlife, and they rejected the authority of the Vedas and Upanishads. Buddhism was one among several Indian religions that did so. The history of Indian Buddhism may be divided into 5 periods: early Buddhism, occasionally called pre-sectarian Buddhism, Nikaya Buddhism or sectarian Buddhism, the period of the early Buddhist schools, early Mahayana Buddhism, late Mahayana, and the era of Vajrayana or the Tantric age. According to Lambert Schmidhausen, pre-sectarian Buddhism is the canonical period prior to the development of different schools with their different positions. The early Buddhist texts include the four principal Pali Nikays, and their parallelogamas found in the Chinese canon, together with the main body of monastic rules, which survive in the various versions of the Patimokkha. However, these texts were revised over time, and it is unclear what constitutes the earliest layer of Buddhist teachings. One method to obtain information on the oldest core of Buddhism is to compare the oldest extant versions of the Theravada and Pali canon and other texts. The reliability of the early sources, and the possibility to draw out a core of oldest teachings, is a matter of dispute. According to Vetter, inconsistencies remain, and other methods must be applied to resolve those inconsistencies. According to Schmidhausen, three positions held by scholars of Buddhism can be distinguished. According to Mitchell, certain basic teachings appear in many places throughout the early texts, which has led most scholars to conclude that Gautama Buddha must have taught something similar to the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, Nirvana, the Three Marks of Existence, the Five Aggregates, Dependent Origination, Karma and Rebirth. According to N. Ross Reed, all of these doctrines are shared by the Theravada Pali texts and the Mahasamkhya schoo's Listambhastra. A recent study by Bhikkhu Analayo concludes that the Theravada Majjhima Nikaya and Sarvastivada Madhyama Agama contain mostly the same major doctrines. Richard Salomon, in his study of the Gandharan texts, which are the earliest manuscripts containing early discourses, has confirmed that their teachings are consistent with non-Mahayana Buddhism, which survives today in the Theravada school of Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, but which in ancient times was represented by 18 separate schools. However, some scholars argue that critical analysis reveals discrepancies among the various doctrines found in these early texts, which point to alternative possibilities for early Buddhism. The authenticity of certain teachings and doctrines have been questioned. For example, some scholars think that karma was not central to the teaching of the historical Buddha, while others disagree with this position. Likewise, there is scholarly disagreement on whether insight was seen as liberating in early Buddhism or whether it was a later addition to the practice of the Four Jhanas. Scholars such as Bronkhorst also think that the Four Noble Truths may not have been formulated in earliest Buddhism, and did not serve in earliest Buddhism as a description of liberating insight. According to Vetter, the description of the Buddhist path may initially have been as simple as the term the middle way. In time, this short description was elaborated, resulting in the description of the Eightfold Path. According to numerous Buddhist scriptures, soon after the parinirvana, from Sanskrit, highest extinguishment, of Gautama Buddha, the first Buddhist council was held to collectively recite the teachings to ensure that no errors occurred in oral transmission. Many modern scholars question the historicity of this event. However, Richard Gombrich states that the monastic assembly recitations of the Buddha's teaching likely began during Buddha's lifetime, and they served a similar role of codifying the teachings. The so-called Second Buddhist Council resulted in the first schism in the Sangha. Modern scholars believe that this was probably caused when a group of reformists called Sthaviras, elders, sought to modify the Vinaya, monastic rule, and this caused a split with the conservatives who rejected this change. They were called Msikas. While most scholars accept that this happened at some point, there is no agreement on the dating, especially if it dates to before or after the reign of Ashoka. Buddhism may have spread only slowly throughout India until the time of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, who was a public supporter of the religion. The support of Ashoka and his descendants led to the construction of more stupas, temples, such as the Mahabodhi temple, and to its spread throughout the Maurya Empire and into neighboring lands such as Central Asia and to the island of Sri Lanka. During and after the Mauryan period, the Sthavira community gave rise to several schools, one of which was the Theravada school which tended to congregate in the south and another which was the Sarvastivada school, which was mainly in North India. Likewise, the Msika groups also eventually split into different sanghas. Originally, these schisms were caused by disputes over monastic disciplinary codes of various fraternities, but eventually, by about 100 CE if not earlier, schisms were being caused by doctrinal disagreements too. Following the schisms, each Sangha started to accumulate their own version of Tripitaka, triple basket of texts. In their Tripitaka, each school included the suttas of the Buddha, a Vinaya basket, disciplinary code, and some schools also added an Abhidharma basket which were texts on detailed scholastic classification, summary and interpretation of the suttas. The doctrine details in the Abhidharmas of various Buddhist schools differ significantly, and these were composed starting about the 3rd century BCE and through the 1st millennium CE. According to the Edicts of Alka, the Mauryan emperor sent emissaries to various countries west of India to spread Dharma, particularly in eastern provinces of the neighboring Seleucid Empire, and even farther to Hellenistic kingdoms of the Mediterranean. It is a matter of disagreement among scholars whether or not these emissaries were accompanied by Buddhist missionaries. In Central and West Asia, Buddhist influence grew, through Greek-speaking Buddhist monarchs and ancient Asian trade routes, a phenomenon known as Greco-Buddhism. An example of this is evidenced in Chinese and Pali Buddhist records, such as Milindapana and the Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhra. The Milindapana describes a conversation between a Buddhist monk and the 2nd century BCE Greek king Menander, after which Menander abdicates and himself goes into monastic life in the pursuit of nirvana. Some scholars have questioned the Milindapana version, expressing doubts whether Menander was Buddhist or just favorably disposed to Buddhist monks. The Kushan Empire came to control the Silk Road trade through Central and South Asia, which brought them to interact with Gandharan Buddhism and the Buddhist institutions of these regions. The Kushans patronized Buddhism throughout their lands, and many Buddhist centers were built or renovated. The Sarvastivada school was particularly favored, especially by Emperor Kanishka. Kushan support helped Buddhism to expand into a world religion through their trade routes. Buddhism spread to Khotan, the Tarim Basin, and China, eventually to other parts of the Far East. Some of the earliest written documents of the Buddhist faith are the Gandharan Buddhist texts, dating from about the 1st century CE, and connected to the Dharmagutaka school. The Islamic conquest of the Iranian plateau in the 7th century, followed by the Muslim conquests of Afghanistan and the later establishment of the Ghaznavid kingdom with Islam as the state religion in Central Asia between the 10th and 12th century led to the decline and disappearance of Buddhism from most of these regions. The origins of Mahayana, Great Vehicle, Buddhism are not well understood, and there are various competing theories about how and where this movement arose. Theories include the idea that it began as various groups venerating certain texts or that it arose as a strict forest ascetic movement. The first Mahayana works were written sometime between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE. Much of the early extant evidence for the origins of Mahayana comes from early Chinese translations of Mahayana texts, mainly those of Lokakima. 2nd century CE. Some scholars have traditionally considered the earliest Mahayanistras to include the first versions of the Prajnaparamita series, along with texts concerning Akabhya, which were probably composed in the 1st century BCE in the south of India. There is no evidence that Mahayana ever referred to a separate formal school or sect of Buddhism, with a separate monastic code, Vinaya, but rather that it existed as a certain set of ideals, and later doctrines, for bodhisattvas. Records written by Chinese monks visiting India indicate that both Mahayana and non-Mahayana monks could be found in the same monasteries, with the difference that Mahayana monks worshipped figures of bodhisattvas, while non-Mahayana monks did not. Mahayana initially seems to have remained a small minority movement that was in tension with other Buddhist groups, struggling for wider acceptance. However, during the 5th and 6th centuries CE, there seems to have been a rapid growth of Mahayana Buddhism, which is shown by a large increase in epigraphic and manuscript evidence in this period. However, it still remained a minority in comparison to other Buddhist schools. Mahayana Buddhist institutions continued to grow in influence during the following centuries, with large monastic university complexes such as Nalanda, established by the 5th century CE Gupta Emperor, Kumaragupta I, and Vikramashila, established under Dharmapala circa 783 to 820, becoming quite powerful and influential. During this period of late Mahayana, 4 major types of thought developed: Niyamaka, Yogra, Buddha nature, Tathgatagarbha, and the epistemological tradition of Dignaga and Dharmakirti. According to Dan Lusthouse, Niyamaka and Yogra have a great deal in common, and the commonality stems from early Buddhism. During the Gupta period, 4th-6th centuries, and the empire of Haravardhana, Buddhism continued to be influential in India, and large Buddhist learning institutions such as Nalanda and Vallabhahi universities were at their peak. Buddhism also flourished under the support of the Pala Empire, 8th-12th centuries. Under the Guptas and Palas, Tantric Buddhism or Vajrayana developed and rose to prominence. It promoted new practices such as the use of mantras, taramis, mudras, mandalas, and the visualization of deities, and Buddhism developed a new class of literature, the Buddhist Tantras. This new esoteric form of Buddhism can be traced back to groups of wandering yogi magicians called Mahasiddhas. The question of the origins of early Vajrayana has been taken up by various scholars. David Seyfert-Rook has suggested that Buddhist Tantra employed various elements of a pan-Indian religious substrate which is not specifically Buddhist, Shaiva or Vaishnava. According to Indologist Alexis Sanderson, various classes of Vajrayana literature developed as a result of royal courts sponsoring both Buddhism and Saivism. Sanderson has argued that Buddhist Tantras can be shown to have borrowed practices, terms, rituals and more from Shaiva Tantras. He argues that Buddhist texts even directly copied various Shaiva Tantras, especially the Bhairava Vidyapatha Tantras. Ronald M. Davidson meanwhile, argues that Sanderson's claims for direct influence from Shaiva Vidyapatha texts are problematic because the chronology of the Vidyapatha Tantras is by no means so well established and that the Shaiva tradition also appropriated non-Hindu deities, texts and traditions. Thus while there can be no question that the Buddhist Tantras were heavily influenced by Kapalika and other Saiva movements, argues Davidson, the influence was apparently mutual. Already during this later era, Buddhism was losing state support in other regions of India, including the lands of the Karkotas, the Pratiharas, the Rashtrakutas, the Pandyas and the Pallavas. This loss of support in favor of Hindu faiths like Vaishnavism and Shaivism is the beginning of the long and complex period of the decline of Buddhism in the Indian subcontinent. The Islamic invasions and conquest of India, 10th to 12th century, further damaged and destroyed many Buddhist institutions, leading to its eventual near disappearance from India by the 1200s. The Silk Road transmission of Buddhism to China is most commonly thought to have started in the late 2nd or the 1st century CE, though the literary sources are all open to question. The first documented translation efforts by foreign Buddhist monks in China were in the 2nd century CE, probably as a consequence, say, of the expansion of the Kushan Empire into the Chinese territory of the Tarim Basin. The first documented Buddhist texts translated into Chinese are those of the Parthian and Shigao. The first known Mahayana scriptural texts are translations into Chinese by the Kushan monk Lokakima in Luoyang, between 178 and 189 CE. From China, Buddhism was introduced into its neighbors Korea, 4th century, Japan, 6th-7th centuries, and Vietnam, circa 1st-2 ND centuries. During the Chinese Tang dynasty, 618-907, Chinese esoteric Buddhism was introduced from India and Chan Buddhism, Zen, became a major religion. Chan continued to grow in the Song dynasty, 9,601,279, and it was during this era that it strongly influenced Korean Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism also became popular during this period and was often practiced together with Chan. It was also during the Song that the entire Chinese canon was printed using over 130,000 wooden printing blocks. During the Indian period of esoteric Buddhism, from the 8th century onwards, Buddhism spread from India to Tibet and Mongolia. Johannes Bronkhorst states that the esoteric form was attractive because it allowed both the secluded monastic community as well as the social rites and rituals important to laypersons and to kings for the maintenance of a political state during succession and wars to resist invasion. During the Middle Ages, Buddhism slowly declined in India, while it vanished from Persia and Central Asia as Islam became the state religion. The Theravada school arrived in Sri Lanka sometime in the 3rd century BCE. Sri Lanka became a base for its later spread to Southeast Asia after the 5th century CE, Myanmar, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia and coastal Vietnam. Theravada Buddhism was the dominant religion in Burma during the Monhanthawadi Kingdom, 12,871,552. It also became dominant in the Khmer Empire during the 13th and 14th centuries and in the Tite Kingdom during the reign of Ram Kamang, 1237 12,471,298. Schools and traditions. Buddhists generally classify themselves as either Theravada or Mahayana. This classification is also used by some scholars and is the one ordinarily used in the English language. An alternative scheme used by some scholars divides Buddhism into the following 3 traditions or geographical or cultural areas: Theravada, or Southern Buddhism, South Asian Buddhism, East Asian Buddhism, or just Eastern Buddhism, and Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, or Northern Buddhism. Some scholars use other schemes. Buddhists themselves have a variety of other schemes. Hinayana, literally lesser or inferior vehicle, is sometimes used by Mahayana followers to name the family of early philosophical schools and traditions from which contemporary Theravada emerged, but as the Hinayana term is considered derogatory, a variety of other terms are used instead, including Nirvakayana, Nikaya Buddhism, early Buddhist schools, sectarian Buddhism and conservative Buddhism. Not all traditions of Buddhism share the same philosophical outlook, or treat the same concepts as central. Each tradition, however, does have its own core concepts, and some comparisons can be drawn between them. The Theravada tradition bases itself on the Pali Canon, considers itself to be the more orthodox form of Buddhism and tends to be more conservative in doctrine and monastic discipline. The Pali Canon is the only complete Buddhist canon surviving in an ancient Indian language. This language, Pali, serves as the school's sacred language and lingua franca. Besides the Pali Canon, Theravada scholastics also often rely on a post-canonical Pali literature which comments on and interprets the Pali Canon. These later works such as the Visuddhimagga, a doctrinal summa written in the 5th century by the exegete Buddhaghosa, also remain influential today. Theravada derives from the Mahivira sect, a Sri Lankan branch of the Vibhayagist Thevaras, which began to establish itself on the island from the 3rd century BCE onwards. Theravada flourished in South India and Sri Lanka in ancient times. From there it spread for the first time into mainland Southeast Asia about the 11th century into its elite urban centers. By the 13th century, Theravada had spread widely into the rural areas of mainland Southeast Asia, displacing Mahayana Buddhism and some traditions of Hinduism. In the modern era, Buddhist figures such as Anagarika Dhammapala and King Mongkut sought to refocus the tradition on the Pali Canon, as well as emphasize the rational and scientific nature of Theravada while also opposing superstition. This movement, often termed Buddhist modernism, has influenced most forms of modern Theravada. Another influential modern turn in Theravada is the Vipassana movement, which led to the widespread adoption of meditation by laypersons. Theravada is primarily practiced today in Sri Lanka, Burma, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia as well as small portions of China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Bangladesh. It has a growing presence in the West, especially as part of the Vipassana movement. Mahayana, Great Vehicle, refers to all forms of Buddhism which considered the Mahayana Sutras as authoritative scriptures and accurate rendering of Buddha's words. These traditions have been the more liberal form of Buddhism, allowing different and new interpretations that emerged over time. The focus of Mahayana is the path of the Bodhisattva, Bodhisattvina, though what this path means is interpreted in many different ways. The first Mahayana texts date to sometime between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE. It remained a minority movement until the time of the Guptas and Palas, when great Mahayana monastic centers of learning such as Nalanda University were established, as evidenced by records left by 3 Chinese visitors to India. These universities supported Buddhist scholarship, as well as studies into non-Buddhist traditions and secular subjects such as medicine. They hosted visiting students who then spread Buddhism to East and Central Asia. Native Mahayana Buddhism is practiced today in China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, parts of Russia and most of Vietnam, also commonly referred to as Eastern Buddhism. The Buddhism practiced in Tibet, the Himalayan regions, and Mongolia is also a form of Mahayana, but is also different in many ways due to its adoption of tantric practices and is discussed below under the heading of Vihana, also commonly referred to as Northern Buddhism. There are a variety of strands in Eastern Buddhism, of which the Pure Land school of Mahayana is the most widely practiced today. In most of China, these different strands and traditions are generally fused together. Vietnamese Mahayana is similarly very eclectic. In Japan in particular, they form separate denominations, with the 5 major ones being Nichiren, peculiar to Japan, Pure Land, Shingon, a form of Vajrayana, Tendai, and Zen. In Korea, nearly all Buddhists belong to the Chogi school, which is officially Sun, Zen, but with substantial elements from other traditions. The goal and philosophy of the Vihana remains Mainist, but its methods are seen by its followers as far more powerful, so as to lead to Buddhahood in just one lifetime. The practice of using mantras was adopted from Hinduism, where they were first used in the Vedas. Tibetan Buddhism preserves the Vajrayana teachings of 8th century India. Tantric Buddhism is largely concerned with ritual and meditative practices. A central feature of Buddhist Tantra is deity yoga, which includes visualization and identification with an enlightened yidam or meditation deity and its associated mandala. Another element of Tantra is the need for ritual initiation or empowerment, abhika, by a guru or lama. Some tantras like the Kyasamsha Tantra features new forms of antinomy and ritual practice such as the use taboo substances like alcohol, sexual yoga, and charnel ground practices which evoke wrathful deities. Monasteries and temples. Buddhist institutions are often housed and centered around monasteries, Sanskrit viharas, and temples. Buddhist monastics originally followed a life of wandering, never staying in one place for long. During the 3-month rainy season, Vasa, they would gather together in one place for a period of intense practice and then depart again. Some of the earliest Buddhist monasteries were at groves, vanas, or woods, such as Jetavana and Sarnath Deer Park. There originally seems to have been 2 main types of monasteries. Monastic settlements, sangharamas, were built and supported by donors, and woodland camps, avashas, were set up by monks. Whatever structures were built in these locales were made out of wood and were sometimes temporary structures built for the rainy season. Over time, the wandering community slowly adopted more settled cenobitic forms of monasticism. Also, these monasteries slowly evolved from the simpler collections of rustic dwellings of early Buddhism into larger, more permanent structures meant to house the entire community, who now lived in a more collective fashion. During the Gupta era, even larger monastic university complexes, like Nalanda, arose, with larger and more artistically ornate structures, as well as large land grants and accumulated wealth. There are many different forms of Buddhist structures. Classic Indian Buddhist institutions mainly made use of the following structures: monasteries, rock-hewn cave complexes, stupas, funerary mounds which contained relics, and temples such as the Mahabodhi temple. In Southeast Asia, the most widespread institutions are centered on wats, which refers to an establishment with various buildings such as an ordination hall, a library, monks' quarters and stupas. East Asian Buddhist institutions also use various structures including monastic halls, temples, lecture halls, bell towers and pagodas. In Japanese Buddhist temples, these different structures are usually grouped together in an area termed the garon. In Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, Buddhist institutions are generally housed in gompas. They include monastic quarters, stupas and prayer halls with Buddha images. The complexity of Buddhist institutions varies, ranging from minimalist and rustic forest monasteries to large monastic centers like Taong Monastery. The core of traditional Buddhist institutions is the monastic community, Sangha, who manage and lead religious services. They are supported by the lay community who visit temples and monasteries for religious services and holidays. In the modern era, the Buddhist Meditation Center, which is mostly used by laypersons and often also staffed by them, has also become widespread. Buddhism in the modern era. Buddhism has faced various challenges and changes during the colonization of Buddhist states by Christian countries and its persecution under modern states. Like other religions, the findings of modern science has challenged its basic premises. One response to some of these challenges has come to be called Buddhist modernism. Early Buddhist modernist figures such as the American convert Henry Olcott, 18,321,907, and Anagarika Dharmapala, 18,641,933, reinterpreted and promoted Buddhism as a scientific and rational religion which they saw as compatible with modern science. East Asian Buddhism meanwhile suffered under various wars which ravaged China during the modern era, such as the Taiping Rebellion and World War II, which also affected Korean Buddhism. During the Republican period, 191,249, a new movement called Humanistic Buddhism was developed by figures such as Taekshu, 18,991,947, and though Buddhist institutions were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, 196,676, there has been a revival of the religion in China after 1977. Japanese Buddhism also went through a period of modernization during the Meiji period. In Central Asia meanwhile, the arrival of communist repression to Tibet, 19,661,980, and Mongolia, between 19,241,990, had a strong negative impact on Buddhist institutions, though the situation has improved somewhat since the 80s and 90s. While there were some encounters of Western travelers or missionaries such as Saint Francis Xavier and Ippolito Desideri with Buddhist cultures, it was not until the 19th century that Buddhism began to be studied by Western scholars. It was the work of pioneering scholars such as Yun Breneuve, Max Miller, Herman Oldenburg and Thomas William Rhys-Davids that paved the way for modern Buddhist studies in the West. The English words such as Buddhism, Buddhist, Buddhist and Buddhist were coined in the early 19th century in the West, while in 1881, Rhys-Davids founded the Polytext Society, an influential Western resource of Buddhist literature in the Pali language and one of the earliest publisher of a journal on Buddhist studies. It was also during the 19th century that Asian Buddhist immigrants, mainly from China and Japan, began to arrive in Western countries such as the United States and Canada, bringing with them their Buddhist religion. This period also saw the first Westerners to formally convert to Buddhism, such as Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott. An important event in the introduction of Buddhism to the West was the 1893 World Parliament of Religions, which for the first time saw well-publicized speeches by major Buddhist leaders alongside other religious leaders. The 20th century saw a prolific growth of new Buddhist institutions in Western countries, including the Buddhist Society, London, 1924, Das Buddhistische Haus, 1924, and Datsungunstscheune in St. Petersburg. The publication and translations of Buddhist literature in Western languages thereafter accelerated. After the Second World War, further immigration from Asia, globalization, the secularization on Western culture as well as a renewed interest in Buddhism among the 60s counterculture led to further growth in Buddhist institutions. Influential figures on post-war Western Buddhism include Shunryu Suzuki, Jack Kerouac, Alan Watts, Thchnhthnh, and the 14th Dalai Lama. While Buddhist institutions have grown, some of the central premises of Buddhism such as the cycles of rebirth and Four Noble Truths have been problematic in the West. In contrast, states Christopher Gowans, for most ordinary Buddhists, today as well as in the past, their basic moral orientation is governed by belief in karma and rebirth. Most Asian Buddhist laypersons, states Kevin Trainor, have historically pursued Buddhist rituals and practices seeking better rebirth, not nirvana or freedom from rebirth. Buddhism has spread across the world, and Buddhist texts are increasingly translated into local languages. While Buddhism in the West is often seen as exotic and progressive, in the East it is regarded as familiar and traditional. In countries such as Cambodia and Bhutan, it is recognized as the state religion and receives government support. In certain regions such as Afghanistan and Pakistan, militants have targeted violence and destruction of historic Buddhist monuments. A number of modern movements in Buddhism emerged during the second half of the 20th century. These new forms of Buddhism are diverse and significantly depart from traditional beliefs and practices. In India, B.R. Ambedkar launched the Navayana tradition, literally, new vehicle. Ambedkar's Buddhism rejects the foundational doctrines and historic practices of traditional Theravada and Mahayana traditions, such as monk lifestyle after renunciation, karma, rebirth, samsara, meditation, nirvana, Four Noble Truths and others. Ambedkar's Navayana Buddhism considers these as superstitions and reinterprets the original Buddha as someone who taught about class struggle and social equality. Ambedkar urged low-caste Indian Dalits to convert to his Marxism-inspired reinterpretation called the Navayana Buddhism, also known as Vimana Buddhism. Ambedkar's effort led to the expansion of Navayana Buddhism in India. The Thai king Mongkut, and his son King Chulalongkorn, r. 18,681,910, were responsible for modern reforms of Thai Buddhism. Modern Buddhist movements include secular Buddhism in many countries, One Buddhism in Korea, the Dhammakaya movement in Thailand, and several Japanese organizations, such as Shinyo-en, Rissei or Soka-gakkai. Some of these movements have brought internal disputes and strife within regional Buddhist communities. For example, the Dhammakaya movement in Thailand teaches a true self doctrine, which traditional Theravada monks consider as heretically denying the fundamental anatta, not self, doctrine of Buddhism. Buddhism has not been immune from sexual abuse and misconduct scandals, with victims coming forward in various Buddhist schools such as Zen and Tibetan. There are huge cover-ups in the Catholic Church, but what has happened within Tibetan Buddhism is totally along the same lines, says Mary Finnegan, an author and journalist who has been chronicling such alleged abuses since the mid-80s. One notably covered case in media of various Western countries was that of Sakyal Rinpoche, which began in 1994, and ended up by his retirement from his position as Rigpa's spiritual director in 2017. Cultural influence. Buddhism has had a profound influence on various cultures, especially in Asia. Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist art, Buddhist architecture, Buddhist cuisine and Buddhist festivals continue to be influential elements of the modern culture of Asia, especially in East Asia and the Sinosphere as well as in Southeast Asia and the Indosphere. According to Li Shenfang, Buddhism has permeated a wide range of fields, such as politics, ethics, philosophy, literature, art and customs, in these Asian regions. Buddhist teachings influence the development of modern Hinduism as well as other Asian religions like Taoism and Confucianism. For example, various scholars have argued that key Hindu thinkers such as Adi Shankara and Patanjali, author of the Yoga Sutras, were influenced by Buddhist ideas. Likewise, Buddhist practices were influential in the early development of Indian yoga. Buddhist philosophers like Dignaga were very influential in the development of Indian logic and epistemology. Buddhist educational institutions like Nalanda and Vikramashala preserved various disciplines of classical Indian knowledge such as grammar and medicine and taught foreign students from China. In an effort to preserve their sacred scriptures, Buddhist institutions such as temples and monasteries housed schools which educated the populace and promoted writing and literacy. This led to high levels of literacy among some traditional Buddhist societies such as Burma. According to David Steinberg, early British observers claimed that Burma was the most literate state between Suez and Japan, and one British traveler in the early 19th century believed that Burmese women had a higher percentage of literacy than British women. Buddhist institutions were also at the forefront of the adoption of Chinese technologies related to bookmaking, including paper and block printing, which Buddhists sometimes deployed on a large scale. The first surviving example of a printed text is a Buddhist charm. The first full printed book is the Buddhist Diamond Sutra, circa 868, and the first hand-colored print is an illustration of Guanyin dated to 947. Buddhists were also influential in the study and practice of traditional forms of Indian medicine. Buddhists spread these traditional approaches to health, sometimes called Buddhist medicine, throughout East and Southeast Asia, where they remain influential today in regions like Sri Lanka, Burma, Tibet, and Thailand. In the Western world, Buddhism has had a strong influence on modern New Age spirituality and other alternative spiritualities. This began with its influence on 20th-century theosophists such as Helena Blavatsky, which were some of the first Westerners to take Buddhism seriously as a spiritual tradition. More recently, Buddhist meditation practices have influenced the development of modern psychology, particularly the practice of mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, and other similar mindfulness-based modalities. The influence of Buddhism on psychology can also be seen in certain forms of modern psychoanalysis. Buddhism also influenced the modern avant-garde movements during the 1950s and 60s through people like D.T. Suzuki and his influence on figures like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. Shamanism is a widespread practice in Buddhist societies. Buddhist monasteries have long existed alongside local shamanic traditions. Lacking an institutional orthodoxy, Buddhists adapted to the local cultures, blending their own traditions with pre-existing shamanic culture. There was very little conflict between the sects, mostly limited to the shamanic practice of animal sacrifice, which Buddhists see as equivalent to killing one's parents. However, Buddhism requires acceptance of Buddha as the greatest being in the cosmos, and local shamanic traditions were bestowed an inferior status. Research into Himalayan religion has shown that Buddhist and shamanic traditions overlap in many respects: the worship of localized deities, healing rituals and exorcisms. The shamanic Gurun people have adopted some of the Buddhist beliefs such as rebirth but maintain the shamanic rites of guiding the soul after death. Jeffrey Samuel describes shamanic Buddhism. Vajrayana Buddhism as practiced in Tibet may be described as shamanic, in that it is centered around communication with an alternative mode of reality via the alternative states of consciousness of Tantric Yoga. Demographics. Buddhism is practiced by an estimated 488 million, 495 million, or 535 million people as of the 2010s, representing 7% to 8% of the world's total population. China is the country with the largest population of Buddhists, approximately 244 million or 18% of its total population. They are mostly followers of Chinese schools of Mahayana, making this the largest body of Buddhist traditions. Mahayana, also practiced in broader East Asia, is followed by over half of world Buddhists. According to a demographic analysis reported by Peter Harvey, Mahayana has 360 million adherents, Theravada has 150 million adherents, and Vajrayana has 18 million adherents. According to Johnson and Grimm, 2013, Buddhism has grown from a total of 138 million adherents in 1910, of which 137 million were in Asia, to 495 million in 2010, of which 487 million are in Asia. Over 98% of all Buddhists live in the Asia-Pacific and South Asia region. North America had about 3.9 million Buddhists, Europe 1.3 million, while South America, Africa and the Middle East had an estimated combined total of about 1 million Buddhists in 2010. Buddhism is the dominant religion in Bhutan, Myanmar, Cambodia, Tibet, Laos, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. Large Buddhist populations live in China, 18%, Japan, 36%, Taiwan, 35%, Macau, 17%, North Korea, 14%, Nepal, 11%, Vietnam, 10%, Singapore, 33%, Hong Kong, 15%, and South Korea, 23%. In Russia, Buddhists form majority in Tuva, 52%, and Kalmykia, 53%. Buryatia, 20%, and Zabaikalsky Krai, 15%, also have significant Buddhist populations. Buddhism is also growing by conversion. In United States, only about a third, 32%, of Buddhists in the United States are Asian, a majority, 53%, are white. Buddhism in the America is primarily made up of native-born adherents, whites and converts. In New Zealand, about 2,535% of the total Buddhists are converts to Buddhism. The 10 countries with the largest Buddhist population densities are. Notes. Subnotes.